A crane for Grandma. Grandma, from high up on the rooftop, could see everything that was going on, and she didn't like what she saw. She wanted to be the centre of attention, and nobody was taking the slightest notice of her. George and Mr. Cranky were running around and getting excited about the enormous animals. Mrs. Cranky was washing up in the kitchen, and Grandma was all alone on the rooftop. Hey you! She shouted. George, get me a cup of tea this minute, you idle little beast! Don't listen to the old goat, Mr. Cranky said. She's stuck where she is, and a good thing too. But we can't leave her up there, Dad, George said. George! Grandma yelled. Oh, you horrible little boy! You disgusting little worm! Fetch me a cup of tea at once, and a slice of carrot cake. We'll have to get her out, Dad, George said. She won't give us any peace if we don't. Mrs. Cranky came outside and she agreed with George. She's my own mother, she said. She's a pain in the neck, Mr. Cranky said. I don't care, Mrs. Cranky said. I'm not leaving my own mother sticking up through the roof for the rest of her life. So in the end, Mr. Cranky telephoned the crane company and asked them to send their biggest crane out to the house at once. The crane arrived 1 hour later. It was on wheels and there were 2 men inside it. The crane men climbed up onto the roof and put ropes under Grandma's arms. Then she was lifted right up through the roof. In a way, the medicine had done Grandma good. It had not made her any less grumpy or bad-tempered, but it seemed to have cured all her aches and pains, and she was suddenly as frisky as a ferret. As soon as the crane had lowered her to the ground, she ran over to George's huge pony, Jack Frost, and jumped onto his back. This ancient old hag, who was now as tall as a house, then galloped about the farm on the gigantic pony, jumping over trees, sheds, and shouting, Out of my way! Clear the decks! Stand back! All of you miserable midgets, or I'll trample you to death! And other silly things like that. But because Grandma was now much too tall to get back into the house, she had to sleep that night in the hay barn with the mice and the rats. Mr. Cranky's great idea. The next day, George's father came down to breakfast in a state of greater excitement than ever. I've been awake all night thinking about it, he cried. About what? George asked him. About your marvellous medicine, of course. We can't stop now, my boy. We must start making more of it at once. More and more and more. The giant saucepan had been completely emptied the day before because there had been so many sheep and pigs and cows and bullocks to be dosed. Why do we need more, Dad? George asked. We've done all our animals and we've made Grandma feel as frisky as a ferret, even though she does have to sleep in the barn. My dear boy, cried Mr. Cranky. We need barrels and barrels of it, tons and tons. Then we will sell it to every farmer in the world so that all of them can have giant animals. We will build a marvellous medicine factory and sell the stuff in bottles at £5 a time. We will be rich and you will become famous. But wait a minute, Dad, George said. There's no waiting, cried Mr. Cranky, working himself up so much that he put butter in his coffee and milk on his toast. Don't you understand what this tremendous invention of yours is going to do to the world? Nobody will ever go hungry again. Won't they? Asked George. Sorry, why won't they? Asked George. Because one giant cow will give 50 buckets of milk a day, cried Mr. Cranky, waving his arms. One giant chicken will make 100 fried chicken dinners, and one giant pig will give you 1,000 pork chops. It's tremendous, my dear boy. It's fantastic. It'll change the world. But wait a minute, Dad, George said again. Don't keep saying wait a minute, shouted George Cranky. There isn't a minute to wait. We must get cracking at once. Do calm down, my dear, Mrs. Cranky said from the other end of the table, and stop putting marmalade on your cornflakes. The heck with my cornflakes, cried Mr. Cranky, leaping up from his chair. Come on, George, let's get going. And the first thing we'll do is to make one more saucepanful as a tester. But Dad, said little George, the trouble is... There won't be any trouble, my boy, cried Mr. Cranky. How can there possibly be any trouble? All you've got to do is to put the same stuff in the saucepan as you did yesterday, and while you're doing it, I'll write down each and every item, and that's how we'll get the magic recipe. But Dad, George said, please listen to me. Why don't you try listening to him? Mrs. Cranky said. The boy's trying to tell you something. but Mr. Cranky was too excited to listen to anyone except himself. "And then," he cried, "when the new mixture is ready, we'll test it out on an old hen just to make absolutely sure we've got it right. And after that, we'll all shout hooray and build the giant factory." "But Dad!" "Come on then, what is it you want to say?" "I can't possibly remember all the hundreds of things I put into the saucepan to make the medicine," George said. "Of course you can, my dear boy," cried Mr. Cranky. "I'll help you. I'll jog your memory. You'll get it in the end. You'll see if you don't. Now then, what was the very first thing you put in?" "I went up to the bathroom first," George said. "I used a lot of things in the bathroom and on Mummy's dressing table." "Come on then," cried Mr. Cranky. "Up we go to the bathroom." When they got there, they found, of course, a whole lot of empty tubes and empty aerosols and empty bottles. "That's great," said Mr. Cranky. "That tells us exactly what you used. If anything is empty, it means you used it." So Mr. Cranky started making a list of everything that was empty in the bathroom. Then they went to Mrs. Cranky's dressing table. "A box of powder," said Mr. Cranky, writing it down. "Helga's hair set, flowers of turnips, perfume. Terrific, this is going to be easy. Where did you go next?" "To the laundry room," George said. "But are you sure you haven't missed anything out up here, Dad?" "That's up to you, my boy," Mr. Cranky said. "Have I?" "I don't think so," George said. So down they went to the laundry room, and once again Mr. Cranky wrote down the names of all the empty bottles and cans. "My goodness me, what a mass of stuff you used," he cried. "No wonder it did magic things. Is that the lot?" "No, Dad, it's not," George said, and he led his father out to the shed where the animals' medicines were kept and showed him the 5 big empty bottles up on the shelf. Mr. Cranky wrote down all their names. "Anything else?" Mr. Cranky asked. Little George scratched his head and thought, but he couldn't remember having put anything else in. Mr. Cranky leapt into his car and drove down to the village and bought new bottles and cans, tubes and cans of everything on his list. He then went to the vet and got a fresh supply of all the animal medicines George had used. "Now, show me how you did it, George," he said. "Come along, show me exactly how you mixed them all together." Marvellous Medicine number 2. They were in the kitchen now, and the big saucepan was on the stove. All the things Mr. Cranky had bought were lined up near the sink. "Come along, my boy," cried Mr. Cranky. "Which one did you put in first?" "This one," George said. "Golden Gloss hair shampoo." He emptied the bottle into the pan. "Now the toothpaste," George went on, "and the shaving foam, and the face cream, and the nail varnish." "Keep at it, my boy," cried Mr. Cranky, dancing round the kitchen. "Keep putting them in. Don't stop, don't pause, don't hesitate. It's a pleasure, my dear fellow, to watch you work." One by one, George poured and squeezed the things into the saucepan. With everything so close at hand, the whole job didn't take him more than 10 minutes. But when it was all done, the saucepan didn't seem to be quite as full as it had been the first time. "Now what did you do?" cried Mr. Cranky. "Did you stir it?" "I boiled it," George said, "but not for long, and I stirred it as well." So Mr. Cranky lit the gas under the saucepan and George stirred the mixture with the same long wooden spoon he'd used before. "It's not brown enough," George said. "Wait a minute, I know what I've forgotten." "What?" cried Mr. Cranky. "Tell me quick, because if we've forgotten even one tiny thing, then it won't work. At least not in the same way." "A quart of brown gloss paint," George said. "That's what I've forgotten." Mr. Cranky shot out of the house and into his car like a rocket. He sped down to the village and bought the paint and rushed back again. He opened the can in the kitchen and handed it to George. George poured the paint into the saucepan. "Aha, that's better," George said. "That's more like the right colour." "It's boiling," cried Mr. Cranky. "It's boiling and bubbling. George, is it ready yet?" "It's ready," George said. "At least I hope it is." "Right," shouted Mr. Cranky, hopping about. "Let's test it. Let's give some to a chicken." "My heavens alive, why don't you calm down a bit?" Mrs. Cranky said, coming into the kitchen. "Calm down," cried Mr. Cranky. "You expect me to calm down? And here we are mixing up the greatest medicine ever discovered in the history of the world. Come along, George, dip in a cupful out of the saucepan and get a spoon and we'll give some to a chicken, just to make absolutely certain we've got the correct mixture." Out in the yard, there were several chickens that hadn't had any of George's Marvellous Medicine number 1. They were pecking about in the dirt in that silly way chickens do. George crouched down, holding a spoonful of Marvellous Medicine number 2. "Come on, chicken," he said. "Good chicken. Chick, chick, chick." A white chicken with black specks on its feathers looked up at George. It walked over to the spoon and went peck. The effect that the medicine number 2 had on this chicken was not quite the same effect produced by medicine number 1, but it was very interesting. Whoosh! Shrieked the chicken as it shot 6 feet up in the air and came down again. Then sparks came flying out of its beak, bright yellow sparks of fire, as though someone was sharpening a knife on a grindstone inside its tummy. Then its legs began to grow longer. Its body stayed the same size, but the 2 thin yellow legs got longer and longer and longer and longer still. "What's happening to it?" cried Mr. Cranky. "Something's wrong," George said. The legs went on growing, and the more they grew, the higher up into the air went the chicken's body. When the legs were about 15 feet long, they stopped growing. The chicken looked perfectly absurd with its long legs and its ordinarily little body perched high up on top. It was like a chicken on stilts. "Oh, my sainted aunts," cried Mr. Cranky. "We've got it wrong. This chicken's no good to anybody. It's all legs. No one wants chicken's legs." "I must have left something out," George said. "I know you left something out," cried Mr. Cranky. "Think, boy, think. What was it you left out?" "I got it," said George. "What was it?" "Flea powder for dogs," George said. "You mean you put flea powder in the first one?" "Yes, Dad, I did. A whole carton of it." "Then that's the answer." "Wait a minute," George said. "Did we have brown shoe polish on our list?" "We did not," said Mr. Cranky. "I used that too," said George. "Well, no wonder it went wrong," said Mr. Cranky. He was already running to his car, and soon he was heading down to the village to buy more flea powder and more shoe polish.